Hey, beautiful souls. If you believe that the most extraordinary love stories begin in the most ordinary moments, then you've found your home. Welcome to Heart Stories, where real connections happen in unexpected places, and remind us that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness. Love doesn't follow timelines or age limits, and today's story is proof that sometimes the universe has perfect timing, even when we think we've missed our chance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined that pruning overgrown roses could lead to the most beautiful chapter of my life. But there I was, kneeling in the dirt with thorns catching on my work gloves, sweat trickling down my neck under the warm Ohio sun, completely unaware that my entire world was about to shift. The backyard belonged to a house on Elm Street in Maplewood Heights, a quiet neighborhood where every lawn told a story and every garden held secrets. I was just Sarah from Green Thumb Landscaping, the woman who showed up with muddy boots and a pickup truck full of tools, ready to wrestle someone's yard back into shape. My name is Sarah, and at 52, I've learned that life rarely goes according to plan. I'd been running my small landscaping business for 8 years now, ever since my divorce left me needing to reinvent everything about my existence. What started as a desperate attempt to pay the bills had become my sanctuary. There's something honest about working with soil and plants, something that doesn't lie to you or break promises. A garden responds to care and attention in ways that people sometimes don't, and I'd found peace in that simplicity. Most of my clients were busy professionals who wanted their outdoor spaces to look magazine perfect without getting their hands dirty, or elderly homeowners who could no longer manage the physical demands of yard work. I specialized in restoration projects, taking neglected spaces and bringing them back to life. It was work that required patience, vision, and the kind of stubborn optimism that believes everything can bloom again given the right conditions. When I got the call about the property on Elm Street, the voice on the other end was warm but hesitant. Robert had explained that his backyard had been neglected since his wife passed 3 years ago. And with the annual Maplewood Garden Tour coming up in 6 weeks, his daughter had insisted he needed professional help. The yard had once been beautiful, he'd told me, but he just hadn't been able to face it alone. There was something in his tone that went beyond simple yard maintenance, a vulnerability that made me quote him a fair price and promise to start the following Monday. I arrived that first morning with my usual equipment and a thermos of coffee that would barely last until noon. The house was a classic 1970s ranch, well-maintained but showing its age, with mature oak trees casting dappled shadows across what had once been carefully planned garden beds. The front yard was neat enough, clearly maintained by a lawn service, but when I walked around to the back, I understood why Robert had sounded so overwhelmed on the phone. The space had good bones, as we say in the business, but everything was overgrown and tangled. Rose bushes that hadn't been pruned in years stretched toward the sky like desperate arms, their blooms small and sparse. Hostas had multiplied and spread beyond their original borders, creating dense colonies that choked out everything else. The stone patio was cracked and uneven, with weeds pushing through every gap, and the small herb garden near the kitchen window had become a jungle of mint and oregano that threatened to take over the entire corner of the yard. But beneath the chaos, I could see the love that had once shaped this space. Someone had carefully planned the placement of each tree and shrub, had chosen plants that would bloom in succession throughout the growing season, had created intimate seating areas and pathways that invited you to wander and discover. This had been someone's pride and joy, their outdoor sanctuary, and now it felt abandoned and forgotten. I was about an hour into my assessment, measuring and making notes on my tablet, when the back door opened and Robert stepped outside. I'd expected someone older, more frail perhaps, but the man walking toward me moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable in his own skin. He was tall and lean, with silver gray hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, and clothes that suggested he spent time outdoors but wasn't used to yard work. His eyes were the kind of blue that reminded me of summer skies, and when he smiled, I felt something flutter in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. We shook hands, and I was surprised by the warmth of his grip and the way he looked directly at me when we spoke. So many of my clients treated me like invisible help, discussing their yard requirements while checking their phones or rushing off to more important matters. But Robert seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about the space, asking questions about plant choices and timing that showed he'd been thinking seriously about the project. As I explained my vision for restoring the garden beds and creating defined spaces for dining and relaxation, I noticed the way his expression softened when I mentioned preserving the memorial rose bush that had clearly been planted in someone's honor. He didn't say anything about it directly, but I saw him touch the small plaque nestled among the thorny branches, and I understood that this renovation was about more than just preparing for a garden tour. We spent nearly an hour walking through the yard together, discussing possibilities and priorities. Robert had ideas about what his late wife had loved most about the garden, and I found myself genuinely excited about the challenge of honoring that history while creating something fresh and sustainable. He was intelligent and thoughtful, asking practical questions about maintenance and showing a real appreciation for the craft of landscaping that made our conversation feel more like collaboration than consultation. When I finally loaded my tools back into the truck and headed home, I realized I was looking forward to starting the actual work in a way that surprised me. It wasn't just professional pride or excitement about a challenging project. Something about Robert's gentle manner and the obvious love he still carried for his late wife had touched something in me that I'd thought was permanently closed off. I'd spent 8 years building walls around my heart, convincing myself that independence was safer than vulnerability. But one morning in an overgrown garden had started to crack those carefully constructed barriers. That evening, as I planned the restoration timeline and researched the best local sources for the plants we'd discussed, I found myself thinking about the way Robert's face had lit up when I'd suggested creating a dedicated space for the bird feeders his wife had loved. There was something beautiful about a man who honored memory while still being open to change, who could see potential for new growth without forgetting what had come before. The work began in earnest the following Wednesday. I started with the most overgrown areas, clearing out invasive plants and dead growth to reveal the structure underneath. It was satisfying, methodical work that allowed my mind to wander while my hands stayed busy. Robert would appear periodically with offers of cold water or iced tea, sometimes staying to help with lighter tasks or simply watching as I worked. Our conversations during these breaks were easy and natural, covering everything from gardening techniques to local history to our shared love of old movies. I learned that Robert had taught high school history for 32 years, that he'd traveled extensively with his wife during summer breaks, and that he'd been struggling to find purpose in retirement beyond the volunteer work he did at the local library. He was curious about my business, asking thoughtful questions about the challenges of being a woman in a traditionally male-dominated field, and showing genuine respect for the expertise I'd developed over the years. By the end of the first week, we'd fallen into a comfortable routine. I'd arrive early, usually before Robert was up, and lose myself in the physical work of restoration. Around mid-morning, he'd emerge with coffee, and we'd review progress and discuss the day's plans. These conversations gradually became the highlight of my workday, something I looked forward to even when the weather was miserable or the work was particularly challenging. The transformation of the yard was dramatic and satisfying, but something else was happening that I wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Every shared laugh, every moment when our hands accidentally touched while examining a plant, every time I caught him watching me work with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, I felt walls I'd built around my heart beginning to crumble. At 52, I'd convinced myself that romantic love was a young person's game, that my chance for that kind of connection had passed with my marriage. But Robert was making me question everything I thought I knew about second chances and the timeline of the heart. The yard was beginning to reveal its former beauty, and I was beginning to remember what it felt like to look forward to seeing someone, to care about making a good impression, to feel that flutter of anticipation that comes with new attraction. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely unexpected, and I had no idea where it might lead. All I knew was that every morning when I turned onto Elm Street, my heart beat a little faster, and every evening when I drove away, I was already planning what I'd share with Robert the next day. 3 weeks into the project, as I was planting the new perennials we'd chosen together, Robert came outside with his usual afternoon iced tea and sat down on the newly repaired patio. We talked about the upcoming garden tour, about his daughter, Maria's visit the following weekend, about the weather forecast and its impact on the newly planted seedlings. The conversation was comfortable and familiar, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, an awareness that had been building between us that neither of us had acknowledged out loud. As the sun began to set behind the oak trees, casting long shadows across the restored garden beds. Robert was quiet for a long moment, simply watching me work. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear, carrying across the yard with a certainty that made me stop what I was doing and really listen. "In 50 years, I've never met anyone I'd marry like you," he said. And the words hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. The words echoed in my mind all night, and by morning I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Men like Robert didn't say things like that to women like me. Women who showed up at their door with dirt under their fingernails and grass stains on their jeans. I'd built my life around being practical, reliable, the kind of person who solved problems rather than created them. Romance was for other people, younger people, people who hadn't already tried marriage and watched it crumble under the weight of everyday disappointments. But when I arrived at Robert's house Thursday morning, he was waiting for me on the front porch with 2 cups of coffee and that same gentle smile that had been disrupting my sleep. The morning air was crisp and sweet with the scent of the honeysuckle growing along his neighbor's fence, and everything about the moment felt both ordinary and charged with possibility. We walked around to the backyard together, discussing the day's agenda with the same easy familiarity we developed over the past 3 weeks. But I was acutely aware of every casual touch, every shared glance, every moment when our conversation drifted away from landscaping and towards something more personal. I'd always been good at reading gardens, understanding what plants needed, and how to create harmony in outdoor spaces. But I was completely out of practice when it came to reading the signals between a man and a woman. Robert's comment from the evening before hung between us like morning mist, present but insubstantial, and I found myself analyzing every word he spoke for hidden meaning. When he mentioned that his daughter Maria would be visiting over the weekend, was that a warning or an invitation? When he asked if I thought the new rose bushes would bloom in time for the garden tour, was he really asking if I'd still be part of his life in 6 weeks? The uncertainty was maddening, but it was also thrilling in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I caught myself humming while I worked, taking extra care with the flower arrangements near the kitchen window where I knew Robert spent his mornings, choosing plants not just for their hardiness and bloom time, but for their beauty and fragrance. I was falling into something I didn't quite understand, something that made me feel both vulnerable and alive in ways I'd convinced myself I was too old to experience. Around noon, as I was taking a break in the shade of the old oak tree, a woman appeared at the side gate calling Robert's name. She was probably my age, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of casual elegance that spoke of country club, memberships and charity luncheons. Her clothes were expensive but understated, and she moved through the yard with the confidence of someone who belonged there. This had to be Linda, Robert's ex-wife, though from the way Robert had spoken about his marriage, I'd assumed she was no longer part of his life. Robert emerged from the house looking surprised and slightly uncomfortable, and their conversation was too quiet for me to hear from where I was working. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing in my direction as if he were worried about what I might think or overhear. Linda's body language was proprietary, the way she touched his arm when she spoke, and positioned herself between Robert and where I was kneeling among the newly planted hostas. After about 10 minutes, she left through the same side gate, but not before looking directly at me with an expression that was hard to read but definitely not friendly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Robert walked over to where I was working, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and his usual ease replaced by something that looked like embarrassment. Linda had stopped by to discuss their daughter's graduation gift, he explained, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. They'd been divorced for 12 years, he told me, but she still felt entitled to opinions about his life choices, especially when it came to Maria. The divorce had been amicable enough, but Linda had never quite accepted that their marriage was truly over, and she had a way of inserting herself into his business whenever she sensed he was moving on. The revelation that Robert was divorced rather than widowed hit me like a physical blow. All this time, I'd been thinking about his late wife, imagining myself as someone helping him heal from grief and loss. The memorial rose bush, the careful way he spoke about honoring past love, the gentle sadness I'd attributed to widowhood, suddenly took on a different meaning. This wasn't about recovering from death, but about navigating the complex aftermath of a relationship that had simply stopped working. The distinction mattered in ways I couldn't fully articulate, but it changed everything about how I understood Robert's situation and my place in it. That evening, I drove home with my mind spinning. I'd spent weeks thinking I was helping a widower reclaim his late wife's garden. But instead, I was working for a divorced man, whose ex-wife clearly still considered him her territory. The garden tour deadline suddenly felt less like a celebration and more like a test, and I wasn't sure what I was being tested for or whether I wanted to pass. I'd managed to avoid romantic drama for 8 years by keeping my relationship simple and my expectations low, but Robert was threatening to complicate everything I'd worked so hard to simplify. Friday morning brought Maria's arrival, and I got my first glimpse of the family dynamics that would shape whatever was developing between Robert and me. She was 29, with her father's intelligent eyes, and what I would soon learn was her mother's protective instincts. Maria worked as a marketing director for a tech company in Chicago, and she'd driven down to Maplewood Heights to check on her father and, I suspected, to get a first-hand look at the woman who'd been spending so much time in his backyard. Our introduction was polite but cautious. Maria was clearly trying to figure out whether I was just the hired help or something more significant, and I was trying to project professional competence while desperately hoping she'd like me. She walked through the yard with the critical eye of someone who'd grown up in this space, commenting on changes and improvements but also noting what had been altered from her mother's original design. It was clear that Linda had been heavily involved in creating the garden, and that Maria had strong opinions about preserving her mother's vision. The three of us spent the morning working together, with Maria helping to move some of the larger planters and Robert providing commentary on which areas had been his wife's particular favorites. I found myself carefully navigating between showing respect for the garden's history and demonstrating my own expertise, trying to prove that I could honor the past while creating something beautiful for the future. It was exhausting, trying to read all the family undercurrents while maintaining my professional composure. But it was also oddly exhilarating to be included in something so personal and meaningful. Around lunchtime, Frank appeared at the back fence, drawn by the unusual activity in Robert's yard. Frank was 67, recently retired from the postal service, and had lived next door for nearly 20 years. He was the kind of neighbor who kept track of everyone's business without being malicious about it. And he'd clearly been curious about the landscaping project and the woman who'd been spending so much time behind Robert's house. Frank's arrival changed the dynamic completely. He was genuinely enthusiastic about the yard transformation, full of compliments about the work I'd done, and stories about how beautiful the space had been in its heyday. He also had opinions about everything from plant choices to the upcoming garden tour, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. But more importantly, Frank was clearly fond of Robert, and protective of him in the way that longtime neighbors can be, and I could tell he was evaluating me as more than just a landscaper. The conversation turned to the annual Maplewood Garden tour, which Frank described as the neighborhood's biggest event. The tour had been running for 15 years, with 8 to 10 homes participating each year, and it drew visitors from across the county. Frank's own garden was a showcase of native Ohio plants and would be included in this year's tour, and he was excited about the competition and camaraderie the event fostered among neighbors. But he also mentioned, with a meaningful look at Robert, that this would be the first year since Linda had moved out that Robert's yard would be included, and that some people in the neighborhood had opinions about that. The comment hung in the air with uncomfortable significance. Maria frowned and asked what Frank meant, and Robert's expression suggested this wasn't the first time the topic had come up. Frank, realizing he'd said too much, tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. Apparently, Linda had been vocal about her concerns regarding Robert's social life, and some of their mutual friends had taken sides in ways that made everything more complicated than it needed to be. This was when I learned about Janet, who owned the corner cafe where much of the neighborhood's social coordination happened. Janet was 48, divorced herself, and had been friends with both Robert and Linda during their marriage. But, according to Frank, Janet had been asking pointed questions about Robert's landscaper and whether there was more than yard work happening at the house on Elm Street. The implication was clear. People were talking, and not all of the talk was friendly. The rest of Friday was subdued, with Maria clearly processing what she'd learned about her parents' social dynamics, and Robert seeming embarrassed about the neighborhood gossip. I focused on my work, trying to stay out of family conversations while wondering whether I was making Robert's life more complicated just by being there. The easy comfort we'd developed over the past 3 weeks felt strained, and I found myself questioning whether I'd misread the situation entirely. Saturday brought unexpected clarity in the form of Betty, the 71-year-old neighborhood matriarch who appeared at Robert's front door with a casserole and what she called a welcome to the neighborhood visit for me. Betty had lived on Elm Street for 43 years, had known every family that had ever occupied these houses, and had strong opinions about everything from property maintenance to personal conduct. She was also, I quickly learned, utterly charming and completely unintimidated by social awkwardness. Betty's garden was legendary in Maplewood Heights, featured in the local newspaper every spring and serving as the unofficial standard against which all other yards were measured. She'd been watching the progress on Robert's restoration with keen interest, and she'd come to meet the woman responsible for what she called the neighborhood's most impressive transformation in years. Her approval meant something in this community, and I could see Robert relaxing as Betty praised both the quality of my work and what she called my obvious respect for the garden's heritage. But Betty hadn't come just to discuss landscaping. She'd also come to address the elephant in the room, the gossip and speculation that was making everyone uncomfortable. With the directness that only comes with age and experience, she told Maria that her mother's continued involvement in Robert's personal life was creating unnecessary drama, and that the neighborhood would benefit from everyone minding their own business. She told Robert that he deserved happiness and shouldn't let other people's opinions dictate his choices. And she told me that anyone who could bring such life back to a neglected space clearly understood the value of nurturing growth, whether in gardens or relationships. It was a masterful performance, delivered with such warmth and authority that no one could take offense. Betty had essentially given her blessing to whatever was developing between Robert and me, while simultaneously telling the neighborhood gossips to focus on their own yards. She stayed for over an hour, sharing stories about the street's history and offering advice about the garden tour that made it clear she expected Robert's yard to be a highlight of the event. That evening, after Maria had left to visit friends in town and Betty had returned to her own garden, Robert and I found ourselves alone in the backyard for the first time since his comment about marriage. The restored space was beautiful in the late afternoon light, with the new plantings settling into their homes and the repaired patio providing a perfect vantage point for enjoying the view. We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the birds discover the feeders I'd hung earlier in the week, and I felt something settle between us that hadn't been there before. Robert spoke first, apologizing for the family drama and neighborhood gossip that had complicated what should have been a simple landscaping project. He explained that his divorce from Linda had been civil but unfinished in ways that made moving forward difficult, and that Maria's protective instincts sometimes made her suspicious of change. He'd been trying to rebuild his life gradually, carefully, in ways that wouldn't upset the delicate balance he'd achieved. But meeting me had disrupted all of his cautious plans. I found myself telling him about my own divorce, about the years I'd spent convinced that independence was safer than vulnerability, about the walls I'd built around my heart to protect myself from disappointment. I explained that his comment about marriage had terrified me not because I didn't want it, but because I'd forgotten it was possible to want something so much. At 52, I'd accepted that romantic love was behind me, that the best I could hope for was companionship and shared interests. But Robert was making me remember what it felt like to dream about partnership, about building something beautiful with another person. The conversation meandered through topics both practical and profound. We talked about the garden tour and what it would mean to showcase our collaboration to the entire neighborhood. We discussed Maria's concerns and Linda's continued presence in Robert's life, acknowledging the complications without letting them overshadow the possibilities. We shared stories about past relationships and future hopes, about the courage it takes to remain open to love after experiencing its loss. As darkness fell and the fireflies began their nightly dance among the restored flower beds, Robert reached for my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like crossing a bridge from which there was no return. His skin was warm and slightly rough from years of teaching and living, and the way his fingers intertwined with mine felt both natural and miraculous. We sat holding hands in the garden we'd created together, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that maybe second chances were real, that maybe the best chapters of my life were still ahead of me. The weekend had changed everything. What started as a landscaping project had become something neither of us had expected. A connection that promised to transform not just Robert's backyard, but both of our carefully ordered lives. The community dynamics, family concerns, and neighborhood gossip had forced us to acknowledge what was happening between us, to name the attraction and affection that had been growing alongside the plants we'd chosen together. But even as I drove home that Sunday evening with my heart full of possibility, I knew the real challenges were just beginning. Linda's proprietary attitude suggested she wouldn't accept Robert's new relationship gracefully. Maria's protective instincts meant I'd have to prove myself worthy of her father's affection. And Janet's position as the neighborhood's information hub meant our every interaction would be scrutinized and discussed. The garden tour was still 3 weeks away, and I had no idea whether Robert and I would navigate the obstacles ahead successfully. All I knew was that I was no longer willing to settle for a life that was safe but small. Robert had reminded me what it felt like to hope for something extraordinary. And even if that hope was fragile and uncertain, it was worth fighting for. The garden we'd restored together was proof that beautiful things could grow from neglected ground, and maybe, just maybe, the same was true for hearts that had been dormant too long. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gentle warmth that made everything seem possible. I pulled into Robert's driveway earlier than usual, my truck loaded with the final plants we'd selected for the shade garden along the north side of his house. The weekend had left me feeling both exhilarated and terrified, as if I'd stepped onto a tightrope without looking down to see how far I might fall. But when Robert appeared at the kitchen window with his morning coffee, that familiar smile spreading across his face when he saw me, all my doubts melted away like frost in sunshine. We worked side by side that morning with a new ease, our conversations flowing seamlessly between practical matters and personal revelations. Robert had always been helpful, but now there was an intimacy to our collaboration that hadn't existed before. When I needed tools, he anticipated which ones before I asked. When I struggled with a particularly stubborn root system, his hands joined mine without hesitation, our fingers brushing as we worked together to free the tangled plant. These small moments of connection felt significant in ways that made my heart race and my cheeks flush like a teenager experiencing her first crush. During our coffee break, Robert told me about his years teaching American history at Maplewood High School, about the students who'd challenged him and the ones who'd surprised him, about the satisfaction of watching young minds discover their own capacity for critical thinking. His passion for education was infectious, and I found myself sharing stories about my own unconventional path to landscaping, about the corporate job I'd left behind after my divorce, about the freedom I'd found in creating beautiful spaces with my own hands. The conversation revealed layers of compatibility I hadn't expected. Robert's analytical mind appreciated the planning and problem-solving aspects of landscape design, while my creative instincts responded to his storytelling ability and his gift for seeing historical patterns in contemporary situations. We were both people who'd chosen second acts that honored our authentic selves rather than others' expectations, and that shared experience created a foundation of understanding that felt both solid and rare. As the days passed, our routine deepened into something that resembled domestic harmony. Robert would have fresh coffee waiting when I arrived, and I'd bring pastries from the bakery downtown that I'd discovered made his favorite blueberry scones. We'd plan the day's work together, but our conversations invariably wandered into territory that had nothing to do with gardening. I learned about his love for jazz music and old movies, about his dream of visiting the gardens of Ireland, about the woodworking projects he'd started and abandoned in his garage. He discovered my secret passion for mystery novels, my attempts at watercolor painting, my ongoing battle with learning to cook for one person instead of a family. The physical work itself became a form of courtship. Robert insisted on helping with tasks that were well within my capability, but I found myself accepting his assistance because it meant we could work closely together. Our hands would touch when we passed tools or steadied plants, and each contact sent electricity through my entire body. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me work with an expression of admiration that had nothing to do with my landscaping skills, and I'd feel beautiful in a way I'd forgotten was possible. One afternoon, as we were installing a small water feature near the patio, Robert mentioned that he'd never been married to someone who shared his love of gardening. Linda had tolerated his interest in the yard, but had never participated beyond choosing paint colors for the garden furniture. The comment was casual, almost offhand. but it revealed something important about his marriage and his appreciation for our partnership that made my chest tight with emotion. Thursday brought the arrival of Tom, Robert's younger brother, who'd driven up from Cincinnati for an unexpected visit. Tom was 42, recently divorced himself, and carried the kind of cynicism that comes from bitter experience with failed relationships. He was polite to me but clearly suspicious, asking pointed questions about my business and my background that felt more like an interrogation than casual conversation. During lunch, which Robert had insisted I join them for, Tom made several comments about the dangers of rebound relationships and the importance of taking time to heal before making major life decisions. The subtext was unmistakable. Tom saw me as a potential threat to his brother's financial and emotional well-being, another woman who might take advantage of a lonely widower's vulnerability. The fact that Robert was divorced rather than widowed seemed lost on Tom, who appeared to view any woman showing interest in his brother with deep suspicion. His protective instincts were understandable, but his obvious distrust made lunch uncomfortable and left me questioning whether Robert's family would ever accept me as anything more than hired help who'd overstepped her boundaries. Robert's reaction to his brother's behavior was telling. He didn't directly contradict Tom's concerns, but he made it clear through his body language and tone that he found the interrogation inappropriate. When Tom suggested that Robert might want to slow down and think carefully about any major life changes, Robert's response was firm but diplomatic. He was old enough to make his own decisions, he said, and he didn't need his younger brother's permission to pursue happiness. That evening, after Tom had left for his hotel, Robert and I sat on the patio watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The garden was nearly complete now, with only a few finishing touches needed before the tour next weekend. Everything we'd planted was thriving, the new growth evidence of our successful collaboration. But the beauty around us couldn't quite dispel the tension Tom's visit had created. Robert apologized for his brother's behavior, explaining that Tom's own divorce had left him bitter about relationships in general, and suspicious of anyone who seemed to offer easy solutions to life's complications. Tom meant well, Robert assured me, but his protective instincts sometimes made him see threats where none existed. The conversation revealed more about Robert's family dynamics and the pressure he felt to justify his choices to people who loved him but didn't necessarily understand him. I found myself telling Robert about my own family's reaction to my divorce, about the well-meaning relatives who'd suggested I was giving up too easily and the friends who'd warned me about the dangers of living alone. People who care about you often have strong opinions about your life choices, I said. But ultimately, you're the one who has to live with the consequences of those decisions. The observation seemed to resonate with Robert, who nodded thoughtfully and reached for my hand in the gathering darkness. Friday afternoon brought a different kind of challenge in the form of Janet from the corner cafe, who appeared at Robert's front door with a fruit salad and a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Janet was the kind of woman who made socializing feel like competitive sport, always perfectly dressed and armed with the latest neighborhood news delivered with surgical precision. She'd clearly come to get a closer look at me and the work I'd been doing, though she presented her visit as a neighborly gesture of support for the upcoming garden tour. Janet's inspection of the yard was thorough and grudgingly complimentary. She praised the plant choices and the obvious improvement in the space's overall appearance, but she also made subtle comments about the expense involved and wondered aloud whether such an extensive renovation had been necessary. Her questions about my background and business were skillfully disguised as friendly interest, but I recognized the fishing expedition for what it was. Janet was gathering information to share with her network of friends and customers, and I was the subject under investigation. The conversation took a more pointed turn when Janet mentioned seeing Linda at the grocery store earlier in the week. According to Janet, Linda had expressed concern about the amount of time I was spending at Robert's house, and had wondered whether the landscaping project was really taking as long as it seemed it should. The comment was delivered with false sympathy, as if Janet were simply passing along information Robert might find useful. But the message was clear. People were talking, and not all of the talk was favorable. Robert's response was measured but firm. The project timeline had been established based on my professional assessment of what the yard needed, he said, and he was completely satisfied with both the quality of the work and the pace of progress. He also mentioned, with a meaningful look at Janet, that he hoped his friends and neighbors would focus on supporting the garden tour, rather than speculating about his personal business. It was a polite but unmistakable request for privacy that left Janet with little choice but to retreat gracefully. After Janet left, Robert and I discussed the challenge of conducting a relationship under the microscope of small-town scrutiny. Neither of us had expected our connection to become a subject of community interest, but the reality was that people were invested in Robert's life in ways that made privacy difficult. The upcoming garden tour would put our collaboration on public display, and we both knew that our interaction during the event would be closely observed and analyzed. The weekend brought Maria back to town, this time with her boyfriend David, a software engineer from Chicago, who seemed genuinely nice but completely out of his element in suburban Ohio. Maria's attitude toward me had softened somewhat since our first meeting, but I could tell she was still evaluating my place in her father's life. She asked thoughtful questions about the plant choices we'd made and showed real interest in learning about landscape design, but there was still a watchfulness to her behavior that suggested she was reserving judgment about my intentions. David's presence actually helped ease some of the tension. He was impressed by the garden transformation and asked technical questions about irrigation and soil preparation that allowed me to demonstrate my expertise without feeling like I was being tested. His obvious admiration for the work I'd done seemed to influence Maria's perception, and by Saturday evening I sensed a shift in her attitude that felt like cautious acceptance, if not outright approval. The four of us spent Saturday evening on the patio, sharing a meal Robert had prepared, and talking about everything from city versus suburban living to the challenges of dating in middle age. Maria revealed that she'd been worried about her father's isolation since the divorce, and was actually relieved to see him connecting with someone new. Her concern, she admitted, wasn't about me specifically, but about the general vulnerability that comes with loneliness and the possibility that someone might take advantage of her father's generous nature. The conversation was illuminating in multiple ways. I learned that Robert's marriage to Linda had been struggling for years before the divorce, that his decision to retire early had been motivated partly by a desire to escape the stress of an unhappy home life, and that his children had been relieved when their parents finally acknowledged that their relationship wasn't working. But I also understood that Maria's protective instincts came from love, not malice, and that earning her trust would require time and patience rather than grand gestures. Sunday morning brought an unexpected gift in the form of rain, the gentle, soaking kind that gardeners pray for, and that would give all our new plantings the deep drink they needed to establish strong root systems. Robert and I spent the morning indoors, ostensibly planning the final details for the garden tour, but actually talking about our hopes and fears for the future. The conversation was interrupted periodically by Maria and David, who were packing for their return to Chicago, but the interruptions felt comfortable rather than intrusive. As Maria prepared to leave, she pulled me aside for a private conversation that surprised me with its directness. She told me that she hadn't seen her father this happy in years, that the change in his demeanor was obvious and wonderful to witness. But she also made it clear that her father's well-being was her primary concern, and that she hoped I understood the responsibility that came with being important to someone who'd already experienced significant loss. The conversation could have felt like a warning or a threat, but Maria's tone was more plea than ultimatum. She was asking me to be careful with her father's heart, to consider the impact of my choices on someone who'd been brave enough to love, again after disappointment. It was a request I could honor and respect, because it came from a place of love rather than possessiveness, and because I felt the same protective instincts toward Robert that Maria did. That afternoon, as the rain continued its gentle percussion on the roof and windows, Robert and I found ourselves talking about the garden tour with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The event would be our first public appearance as whatever we were becoming, our collaboration on display for the entire community to see and judge. We'd created something beautiful together, but we both knew that beauty alone wouldn't shield us from the opinions and expectations of people who had their own ideas about appropriate behavior and suitable relationships. The rain had transformed the garden into something magical, with every leaf and flower glistening with moisture, and the colors intensified by the gray sky above. We stood at the kitchen window watching the water collect in the birdbath we'd installed, near the memorial rosebush, and I felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with landscaping deadlines. This space had become ours in ways that transcended professional collaboration, a physical manifestation of the connection we'd discovered in each other. Robert's arm slipped around my waist as we watched the rain, and I leaned into his warmth, with a sense of rightness that surprised me with its intensity. At 52, I'd thought I understood my own capacity for love and partnership, but Robert was teaching me that the heart could expand in ways that defied logic and timeline. The garden tour would be a test of our ability to withstand public scrutiny, but standing there in his kitchen with rain painting silver patterns on the windows, I felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The week leading up to the tour would bring new pressures and complications, I was certain. Linda's disapproval would likely become more vocal. Janet's curiosity would intensify, and the entire neighborhood would have opinions about the relationship that had bloomed alongside the flowers we'd planted together. But for now, in the peaceful aftermath of rain and family visits and difficult conversations, I allowed myself to believe that love was worth fighting for, regardless of age or circumstance, or the opinions of people who'd forgotten what it felt like to discover someone who made the world feel full of possibility again. The morning of the garden tour dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds that promised rain at the worst possible moment. I arrived at Robert's house at 6 in the morning to find him already dressed and pacing nervously around the kitchen. His usual calm demeanor replaced by an anxiety that matched my own. We had 5 hours before the first visitors would arrive. 5 hours to complete the final preparations and somehow transform ourselves from anxious gardeners into confident hosts, ready to showcase our collaboration to the entire community. Because weather wasn't our only concern. Over the past week, the neighborhood tension had escalated in ways that made the garden tour feel less like a celebration and more like a battlefield. Linda had been calling Robert almost daily with suggestions and concerns about the appropriateness of featuring a garden that had been extensively redesigned without consulting her. She'd reminded him repeatedly that the original plantings had been her choices, her vision, and that the tour would be displaying the work of a stranger rather than the family history the space had once represented. Janet had been equally problematic, stopping by the corner cafe's regular customers with updates about the situation on Elm Street that painted me as an opportunistic outsider, taking advantage of a lonely man's vulnerability. According to the reports that filtered back through Frank and Betty, Janet had suggested that my extended timeline for the project was evidence of deliberate manipulation, and that the garden tour would reveal whether I was truly qualified for the work I'd been hired to complete. But the most troubling development had come from an unexpected source. On Wednesday afternoon, as I was making final adjustments to the plant arrangements near the front entrance, a woman I'd never seen before approached me with a clipboard and an official-looking badge. She introduced herself as Patricia Williams, from the Maplewood Heights Building and Safety Department, and she was there to investigate complaints about unauthorized landscaping work that might be in violation of neighborhood covenants and city regulations. The conversation that followed was surreal and terrifying. According to Patricia, someone had filed formal complaints, alleging that my work included structural changes to drainage patterns, installation of irrigation systems without proper permits, and removal of mature trees that might be protected under municipal guidelines. The allegations were detailed and specific, suggesting that whoever had filed them had intimate knowledge of both the work I'd performed and the regulatory requirements that governed it. I spent 2 hours walking through the property with Patricia, explaining every change I'd made and providing documentation for all the plants and materials I'd used. My business license was current, my insurance was adequate, and every modification I'd made fell well within the scope of routine landscape maintenance. But the investigation was time-consuming and embarrassing, conducted in full view of neighbors who gathered to watch the proceedings with undisguised curiosity. Robert was furious about the complaints, but his anger was tempered by confusion about who might have initiated such a vindictive action. The timing was clearly intended to disrupt the garden tour, but the level of detail in the allegations suggested someone with either professional knowledge of landscaping regulations or access to information about my business practices. We spent that evening trying to identify potential suspects, but the list of people who might want to sabotage our relationship was depressingly long. Thursday brought another crisis in the form of a cancellation from the garden tour organizing committee. According to the message Robert received, there had been concerns raised about the appropriateness of including a property that was currently under investigation by the building department. The committee felt it would be prudent to remove Robert's garden from the tour until all regulatory questions had been resolved. A decision that felt like a public humiliation designed to punish us for whatever crime we'd committed by falling in love. The cancellation hit Robert harder than I'd expected. He'd been looking forward to showcasing the garden's transformation, to demonstrating to his community that he was capable of creating something beautiful and meaningful in the aftermath of his divorce. More than that, he'd wanted to publicly celebrate our partnership, to show his neighbors and friends that he'd found someone who brought joy and creativity into his life. The committee's decision felt like a rejection of both our work and our relationship, a judgment that we'd overstepped some invisible boundary of acceptable behavior. I found myself torn between rage and despair. The garden we'd created together was genuinely beautiful, a space that honored the property's history while reflecting our shared vision for its future. The investigation had revealed no violations, no shortcuts, no evidence of the unprofessional conduct that had been alleged. But the damage to our reputations and our confidence had been done, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being punished for something that should have been celebrated. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of David Martinez, a landscape architect from the county extension office who'd heard about the situation through professional networks. David had driven over from the regional office to see the garden that had generated so much controversy, and his assessment was unequivocally positive. Not only was the work professionally executed, he said, but the design showed a sophisticated understanding of native plant communities and sustainable gardening practices that exceeded what he typically saw in residential projects. David's evaluation provided the vindication we desperately needed, but it also deepened the mystery of who had filed the original complaints. The allegations had been specific enough to suggest professional knowledge, but they'd been completely unfounded in ways that suggested malicious intent rather than legitimate concern. David agreed to provide a written assessment of the garden's compliance with all relevant regulations, but the formal process would take several days, well past the date of the garden tour. That evening, as Robert and I sat in the garden that had brought us together and somehow made us targets of community hostility, we finally acknowledged the elephant that had been lurking in our conversations for weeks. Someone was actively working to sabotage our relationship, someone with enough knowledge of my business and access to regulatory processes to create serious problems for both of us. The revelation that we were dealing with deliberate malice rather than unfortunate circumstances changed everything about how we understood our situation. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my adult life. Robert suggested that maybe we should step back from our relationship until the controversy died down, that perhaps my association with him was causing problems for my business that I couldn't afford to ignore. He'd watched me build Green Thumb, landscaping from nothing, he said, and he couldn't bear the thought that caring about him might destroy the independence and security I'd worked so hard to achieve. I told him that backing down now would be letting the people who wanted to hurt us win, that abandoning our relationship because of anonymous complaints and neighborhood gossip would be giving up the best thing that had happened to either of us in years. But I also understood his concern for my professional reputation, and I couldn't deny that the controversy was affecting my ability to focus on other clients and projects. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance among the plants we'd chosen together, and I felt the weight of everything we were risking for a love that was still new and uncertain. At 52, I'd learned to be practical about relationships, to weigh costs and benefits before investing too heavily in romantic possibilities. But Robert had awakened something in me that defied practical calculation, a willingness to fight for something beautiful even when the odds were stacked against us. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and perfect gardening weather, a cruel irony given that Robert's garden had been excluded from the tour that should have been our triumph. I arrived early to find Robert already outside, deadheading roses, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was trying to work through his frustration. The garden looked magnificent in the morning light, every plant thriving, every color combination working exactly as we'd envisioned, and the exclusion from the tour felt like a particularly painful form of injustice. Around 9 o'clock, as the official garden tour was beginning at other locations throughout the neighborhood, Betty appeared at Robert's front gate with a folding chair and a thermos of coffee. She'd come to stage what she called an informal protest, she announced, a one-woman demonstration in support of the garden that should have been included in the tour. Betty had lived in Maplewood Heights longer than anyone else on the committee, she reminded us, and she remembered when the tour had been started as a celebration of community beauty rather than an exercise in social politics. Betty's protest attracted attention almost immediately. Frank appeared from next door, followed by several other neighbors who'd heard about the controversy and come to see the excluded garden for themselves. Word spread quickly through the unofficial networks that govern small communities, and by noon, we had a steady stream of visitors who'd finished the official tour and decided to stop by Robert's house to judge the situation for themselves. Thus, informal gathering that developed in Robert's front yard had an impromptu festival atmosphere that was both wonderful and surreal. People brought lawn chairs and coolers. Children played in the front yard while adults toured the garden in small groups. And someone even brought a portable speaker that filled the air with jazz music that seemed to encourage lingering and conversation. It wasn't the formal tour we'd planned for, but it was something better. A genuine community response to beauty and injustice that transcended the political maneuvering that had excluded us. Around 2 o'clock, as the unofficial tour was reaching its peak attendance, Linda arrived with 2 women I didn't recognize, and an expression that suggested she'd come prepared for battle. She marched through the gate and directly to Robert, demanding to know why he was staging what she called a public spectacle on property that still contained her personal investment. The original garden design had been hers, she announced to the crowd, and she hadn't given permission for it to be displayed as someone else's work. The confrontation that followed was ugly and public, exactly what Linda had intended. She accused me of professional misconduct, questioned my qualifications, and suggested that the regulatory investigation had revealed serious problems that the community should know about. She positioned herself as the injured party, the ex-wife, whose creative work was being exploited by an opportunistic stranger who'd manipulated her former husband into an inappropriate relationship. Robert's response was swift and decisive. He told Linda that she'd forfeited any claim to opinions about his property or his personal life when she decided to end their marriage 12 years ago. The garden reflected his choices and his investment, he said, and she had no right to interfere with his decisions about how to use or display his own property. More importantly, he continued, her behavior over the past month had been petty and vindictive, and he was tired of allowing her insecurity to dictate his happiness. The public nature of the confrontation made it more dramatic than it might have been in private, but it also made Linda's behavior visible to the entire community in ways that couldn't be denied or reinterpreted. People who'd been listening to Janet's gossip or wondering about the regulatory complaints could see for themselves the source of much of the controversy that had surrounded our relationship. Linda's accusations were clearly motivated by jealousy rather than legitimate concern, and her willingness to create a public scene revealed character traits that many neighbors found distasteful. As Linda stormed off with her supporters, Janet appeared at the edge of the crowd looking uncomfortable and defensive. Several people approached her with pointed questions about the stories she'd been spreading at the cafe, and it became clear that the informal tour had created an opportunity for truth-telling that worked in our favor rather than against us. People who'd heard second-hand reports about regulatory violations and professional misconduct could see the garden for themselves and draw their own conclusions about the quality of the work I'd performed. The afternoon stretched into evening as neighbors lingered to enjoy the garden and the sense of community that had emerged from the controversy. Maria arrived around 6 o'clock, having driven down from Chicago specifically to support her father and see the garden that had become the center of so much drama. Her presence was a powerful statement of family support that wasn't lost on the assembled crowd, and her obvious pride in her father's choices helped shift the narrative from scandal to celebration. As the sun began to set and the informal gathering gradually dispersed, Robert and I found ourselves alone in the garden for the first time all day. The crisis that had threatened to destroy our relationship had somehow strengthened it instead, forcing us to choose publicly whether we were willing to fight for what we'd found together. The support we'd received from Betty, Frank, Maria, and dozens of neighbors had shown us that community could be a source of strength rather than judgment when people were given the opportunity to see truth for themselves. The regulatory investigation concluded the following Tuesday with a formal letter stating that no violations had been found and no further action would be required. David Martinez's written assessment praised both the technical quality of the work and the environmental sensitivity of the design choices, language that effectively cleared my professional reputation of any taint from the anonymous complaints. We never definitively identified who had filed the false allegations, though the timing and specificity suggested coordination between Linda and someone with knowledge of municipal regulations. The aftermath of the unofficial tour brought unexpected opportunities and recognition. 3 neighbors hired me for their own landscaping projects. Word spread through professional networks about the garden that had generated so much positive attention, and a local magazine asked to feature the space in an upcoming article about successful garden renovations. More importantly, the crisis had forced Robert and me to commit publicly to our relationship in ways that made retreat impossible and progress inevitable. 6 weeks later, as we sat in the garden watching the late summer flowers bloom in the beds we'd planted together, Robert repeated the words that had started everything between us. "In 50 years," he said, "I've never met anyone I'd marry like you." But this time, the statement was a question rather than an observation, delivered with a small velvet box that contained a ring that sparkled in the evening light like captured starfire. My answer was yes, of course, given through tears of joy and disbelief that life could surprise me so completely at an age when I'd thought all the major plot twists were behind me. We were married 3 months later in a ceremony held in the garden we'd created together, surrounded by friends and family and neighbors who'd learned that love doesn't follow schedules or social expectations, but blooms according to its own mysterious timeline. The garden continues to evolve and grow, just as our relationship does, changing with the seasons, but rooted in the foundation of trust and compatibility we discovered while working together in the soil. At 52 and 56, we're proof that second chances are real, that it's never too late to plant seeds of happiness, and that the most beautiful gardens are those tended by two people who understand that love, like growing things, requires patience, faith, and the willingness to believe in possibilities that can't yet be seen. The investigation letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like the first day of spring, even though we were well into summer. I held the official document in my hands, reading the words that cleared my name and validated everything Robert and I had built together, and felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying. David Martinez had been thorough in his assessment, documenting not only that my work met all regulatory requirements, but that it exceeded industry standards for environmental sustainability and design excellence. Robert was in his kitchen making breakfast when I called with the news, and the joy in his voice when I read him the letter's conclusion made my eyes fill with tears I'd been holding back for weeks. We'd weathered the storm of accusations and community drama, but the toll had been greater than either of us had wanted to admit. Now, with official vindication in hand, we could finally exhale and begin to envision a future that wasn't overshadowed by anonymous complaints and neighborhood politics. The aftermath of our unofficial garden tour had created ripple effects throughout Maplewood Heights that continued to surprise us both. Betty had started what she called the Real Garden Club, a group dedicated to celebrating actual horticultural achievement rather than social positioning, and membership was growing weekly. Frank had appointed himself the unofficial historian of Elm Street, documenting the transformation of Robert's property, with before and after photographs that he shared with anyone willing to listen to his commentary on the power of good landscaping to revitalize a neighborhood. More significantly, 3 families on our street had approached me about designing their own garden renovations. The Hendersons at the corner house wanted to create a butterfly garden that would complement the native plant community I'd established in Robert's yard. The young couple 2 doors down was interested in edible landscaping that would provide fresh herbs and vegetables while maintaining the aesthetic standards the neighborhood expected. Most surprisingly, the elderly widow across the street had asked me to help her create a memorial garden for her late husband, specifically requesting design elements that would honor memory while embracing new growth. Each new project felt like vindication of a different sort, proof that my work could speak for itself when people were given the opportunity to see beyond gossip and speculation. The contracts also provided financial security that allowed me to be more selective about future clients, choosing projects that excited me creatively rather than simply paying the bills. At 52, I was experiencing the kind of professional recognition I'd dreamed of but never quite believed was possible in a field dominated by larger, more established companies. The personal recognition was equally meaningful. Janet's influence at the corner cafe had waned considerably after her role in spreading unfounded rumors became widely known. People still gathered there for coffee and conversation, but the tone of the discussions had shifted away from malicious speculation toward more constructive community planning. Janet herself had made awkward attempts at reconciliation, stopping by Robert's house with apologies that felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. But the trust that had been broken couldn't be easily repaired. Linda's public confrontation during our informal tour had backfired spectacularly, revealing character traits that made many of her former supporters uncomfortable. Her attempts to position herself as the injured party in Robert's new relationship had fallen flat when witnesses, could see her vindictive behavior firsthand. The divorce that had occurred 12 years earlier suddenly seemed more understandable to people who'd previously sympathized with her version of events, and Robert's decision to move on with his life appeared reasonable rather than hasty. Maria's support had been crucial in shifting family dynamics away from suspicion and toward acceptance. Her weekend visits became regular occurrences, often including David, who developed a genuine appreciation for small-town life and gardening. That surprised everyone, including himself. Maria had also begun calling me directly rather than going through her father, a small change that signaled her acceptance of my permanent place in Robert's life and her willingness to develop an independent relationship with me. The garden itself continued to evolve throughout the summer, each week bringing new blooms and subtle changes that reflected the careful planning we'd done together. The memorial rosebush had produced its most abundant flowering in years, as if responding to the renewed attention and care the entire space was receiving. The water feature we'd installed near the patio attracted birds that provided daily entertainment, and the herb garden by the kitchen window supplied fresh ingredients for the cooking experiments Robert and I had begun undertaking together. Our domestic routines had settled into patterns that felt both comfortable and exciting. I would arrive most mornings to find Robert already outside, checking on plants or adjusting the irrigation system with the dedicated attention of someone who'd discovered a new passion. We'd plan the day's activities over coffee, but our conversations invariably wandered into territory that had nothing to do with landscaping and everything to do with building a life together. The cooking experiments had become a particular source of joy and hilarity. Robert's culinary skills were limited but enthusiastic, while my experience feeding a family had left me with techniques that needed adjustment for smaller portions. We'd burned more meals than we'd successfully completed, but the process of learning together had created intimacy that felt more significant than the actual food we produced. Sharing kitchen disasters and small triumphs had become a form of courtship that neither of us had expected but both of us treasured. Our evening conversations on the patio had deepened into the kind of philosophical discussions that revealed fundamental compatibility. Robert's background in history provided context for contemporary issues that I found fascinating, while my practical experience building a business offered perspectives on problem-solving and resilience that he'd never considered. We were both readers, both travelers in our dreams, if not always in reality, both people who'd learned to find meaning in work that served others rather than simply advancing personal ambition. The physical attraction between us had grown stronger, rather than fading, fed by emotional intimacy and shared experience in ways that felt both surprising and natural. At 52, I'd assumed that romantic passion was a young person's experience, that mature relationships were based on companionship and practical compatibility rather than the kind of electric connection that made holding hands feel like a minor miracle. Robert was teaching me that desire could deepen with understanding, that physical attraction could grow from intellectual and emotional connection in ways that were more powerful than anything I'd experienced in my youth. By late summer, we'd begun discussing the future in concrete terms rather than hopeful abstractions. Robert's house was larger than my apartment and better suited to entertaining the friends and family who'd become part of our extended community. My business could operate from his garage more efficiently than from the storage unit I'd been renting, and the combination of our resources would allow for lifestyle improvements that neither of us could afford individually. But more than practical considerations, we were planning a future based on shared values and complementary dreams. Robert wanted to travel to the gardens of Europe, something his marriage to Linda had never accommodated. I wanted to expand my business to include landscape design consultation and native plant education, goals that would benefit from the stability and support of a true partnership. Together, we envisioned possibilities that felt both achievable and exciting in ways that made the future feel bright, rather than simply endurable. The conversation about marriage began gradually, emerging from discussions about practical matters like insurance and property ownership, but evolving into something more romantic and traditional. Robert's proposal, when it finally came, was delivered, in the garden we'd created together, surrounded by plants that had grown from small beginnings into something beautiful and permanent. The ring he offered had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who'd been married for 63 years, and who'd believed that true partnership was the foundation of a meaningful life. My acceptance was immediate and wholehearted, given without the hesitation or analysis that had characterized my approach to major decisions since my divorce. At 52, I'd learned to trust my instincts about people and situations. And every instinct I possessed told me that Robert was the partner I'd been hoping for without quite believing I'd find. The age that others saw as a limitation felt like an advantage to us, bringing wisdom and perspective that made our choices feel deliberate rather than impulsive. The wedding planning became a community effort that reflected the relationships we'd built through the garden tour controversy and its aftermath. Betty volunteered to coordinate the catering, drawing on decades of experience organizing church socials and neighborhood gatherings. Frank offered to officiate, having obtained online ordinations specifically for the occasion. Maria took charge of photography and flowers, approaching both tasks with the organizational skills she'd developed in her marketing career. We decided to hold the ceremony in the garden during peak autumn color, when the trees would provide a backdrop of gold and crimson that would complement the late-season blooms we'd specifically chosen for their September flowering. The guest list included neighbors who'd supported us through difficult times, professional colleagues who'd become friends, and family members who'd learned to celebrate our happiness rather than question our choices. The morning of our wedding dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that makes Ohio beautiful enough to justify enduring its winters. I woke in my apartment for the last time, surrounded by boxes packed for the move that would officially combine our lives and households. The nervousness I felt was entirely positive, the kind of anticipatory excitement that comes with embarking on adventures that promise to exceed expectations. Maria arrived early to help with final preparations, bringing flowers from her own garden and a bottle of champagne that had been waiting in her refrigerator for an occasion worth celebrating. We worked together arranging the ceremony space, positioning chairs and decorations with the kind of collaborative efficiency that suggested our relationship had evolved beyond polite step-family dynamics into genuine friendship. Robert spent the morning in his kitchen, preparing food for the reception with the focused intensity he brought to all projects he cared about. The menu reflected dishes we'd successfully mastered during our cooking experiments, comfort foods that would satisfy guests while representing our journey from culinary disasters to modest competence. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. We were serving food that represented growth, learning, and the willingness to try again after initial failures. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt, focused on promises that felt both traditional and personally meaningful. Robert's vows spoke of unexpected second chances and the courage required to remain open to love after experiencing disappointment. My promises centered on partnership and growth, on the commitment to tend our relationship with the same care and attention we'd brought to creating the garden where we stood. Frank's officiating was surprisingly eloquent, drawing on his postal service experience to compare marriage to the daily delivery of small kindnesses that accumulate into something sustaining and reliable. Betty wept openly during the exchange of rings, her emotions reflecting the investment she'd made in our relationship from its earliest days. Even Janet attended, offering congratulations that seemed genuine despite the awkwardness created by her earlier behavior. The reception stretched into the evening as guests lingered to enjoy the garden and the sense of celebration that had replaced the controversy and drama of earlier months. Children played among the flower beds while adults shared stories and advice, creating the kind of intergenerational community gathering that reminded everyone why neighborhoods matter. The space that had been the source of so much conflict had become the setting for joy and connection that would be remembered long after the specific details faded. As the last guests departed and we began cleaning up the remnants of our celebration, Robert and I found ourselves alone in the garden that had brought us together and witnessed our commitment to each other. The plants we'd chosen and nurtured together surrounded us with beauty that would continue growing and changing, just as our relationship would evolve through seasons of challenge and abundance. Looking back at the journey from that first morning when I'd arrived to assess an overgrown backyard to this evening when I was officially Mrs. Sarah Matthews, I marveled at the unpredictability of life's timing and the power of remaining open to possibilities that seem impossible until they become inevitable. At 52, I discovered that the best chapters of life often begin when you've stopped expecting them, that love can bloom in any season when conditions are right for growth. The garden around us was proof that beautiful things could emerge. From neglected ground, that careful attention and patient nurturing could transform spaces that seemed beyond redemption. Our marriage was founded on the same principles, the belief that growth was always possible, that beauty could be cultivated at any stage of life, and that the most meaningful partnerships were those based on shared labor and mutual respect. As we turned off the patio lights and walked toward the house we would now officially share, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from building something lasting and beautiful, with someone who understands both the work involved and the joy that makes that work worthwhile. The garden would continue growing and changing, just as we would, but the foundation we'd created together was strong enough to support whatever seasons lay ahead. Robert's hand found mine in the darkness, and I squeezed his fingers with all the gratitude and hope I felt for this unexpected chapter of our lives. At 52 and 56, we were proof that it's never too late to plant seeds of happiness, that love doesn't follow social schedules or age restrictions, and that the most beautiful gardens are always those tended by two people who understand that the best things in life are worth waiting for, worth working for, and worth celebrating when they finally bloom. 5 years have passed since that first morning when I knocked on Robert's door with a clipboard and a heart I thought was permanently closed to romantic possibility. The woman who stands in this kitchen now, watching the sunrise paint golden light across the garden we've continued to nurture and expand, bears little resemblance to the guarded landscaper who arrived with muddy boots and careful boundaries. Marriage has a way of transforming people in directions they never imagined, not by changing who they are, but by revealing capacities for joy and partnership that circumstances had forced into hibernation. The garden has evolved dramatically over these years, shaped by seasons of experimentation and the confidence that comes from deep collaboration. What began as a restoration project has become a living laboratory where we test new plant combinations, explore sustainable growing methods, and create spaces that serve multiple purposes beyond mere beauty. The memorial rose bush still anchors the design, but it's now surrounded by a cutting garden that supplies flowers for our dining table and gifts for neighbors, a testament to how honoring the past can coexist with embracing present abundance. Robert's retirement has blossomed into an unexpected second career as a garden historian, documenting the horticultural heritage of Maplewood Heights and consulting with other communities interested in preserving their landscape traditions. His background in research and his natural storytelling ability have made him a sought-after speaker at garden clubs and historical societies throughout Ohio. Watching him discover this new passion has been one of the unexpected pleasures of our marriage, proof that love doesn't just change hearts but opens pathways to possibilities that were previously invisible. My own business has grown beyond anything I dreamed possible when I was struggling to establish Green Thumb Landscaping as a viable enterprise. The publicity generated by our garden tour controversy, initially devastating, ultimately created opportunities that transformed my professional reputation from local handywoman to respected landscape designer. I now employ 3 part-time assistants and maintain a waiting list of clients that extends 6 months into the future. More importantly, I've found my niche in restoration projects that honor historical landscape designs while incorporating contemporary environmental principles. The success has allowed me to be selective about projects in ways that prioritize meaning over profit. Last year, I completed a memorial garden for the Children's Hospital downtown, creating a space where families could find peace during difficult times. This spring, I'm designing a teaching garden for the elementary school where Robert once volunteered, an outdoor classroom that will introduce children to the science and art of growing things. These projects feel like natural extensions of what Robert and I learned together, that gardens are most meaningful when they serve purposes beyond personal pleasure. Our house has become an unofficial community center for Maplewood Heights, hosting everything from informal garden tours to holiday gatherings for neighbors who've become genuine friends. Betty, now 76 and still formidable, has appointed herself our social coordinator, organizing potluck dinners and seasonal celebrations with the efficiency of someone who spent decades bringing people together. Frank continues to document neighborhood changes with obsessive dedication, creating archives that future residents will treasure as records of community evolution. The relationship dynamics that once seemed so complicated have settled into patterns that feel both stable and dynamic. Linda has gradually accepted that her chapter with Robert truly ended years ago, and while she's never become a friend, she's stopped creating obstacles to his happiness. Her own life has moved forward in directions that suggest she's found peace with the choices that led to their divorce. Occasionally, she sends holiday cards that include brief updates about her travels and volunteer work, communications that feel more like friendly acquaintances than bitter ex-spouses. Maria has become the daughter I never had, though our relationship required patience and time to develop beyond the polite wariness that characterized our early interactions. Her initial protectiveness of Robert gradually transformed into genuine affection for me as she witnessed how our partnership enhanced rather than diminished her father's well-being. She calls regularly now, sharing work challenges and relationship updates with the kind of casual intimacy that speaks of real family connection. Her wedding 3 years ago, held in our garden, felt like official confirmation that I'd been accepted, as permanent family rather than temporary addition. David proposed to Maria in the same spot where Robert had proposed to me, creating a romantic tradition that we hope future generations might continue. Their relationship has provided opportunities for Robert and me to practice grandparent skills, as they've produced 2 children who view our house as their second home and our garden as their personal playground. Watching Robert teach his grandson to identify different types of roses and his granddaughter to plant seeds in neat rows has revealed depths of tenderness that make me fall in love with him all over again. The challenges we faced during our courtship seem almost quaint compared to the complexities of building a life together, but they provided foundation skills that have served us well during the inevitable difficulties of marriage. We learned early to communicate directly about problems rather than letting resentment fester, to prioritize our partnership over outside opinions, and to view obstacles as opportunities for growth rather than threats to our happiness. These lessons have been tested repeatedly as we've navigated everything from health scares to financial decisions, to the ordinary negotiations required when 2 independent people choose to become interdependent. Robert's heart attack 2 years ago forced us to confront mortality in ways that were terrifying but ultimately strengthening. The weeks of hospitals and cardiac rehabilitation reminded us that time together is precious and finite, that the ordinary moments of shared morning coffee and evening garden walks are gifts to be treasured rather than taken for granted. His recovery was complete, but the experience left us both more intentional about prioritizing what truly matters and less willing to waste energy on concerns that won't matter in the long term. The financial merger of our separate lives has been surprisingly smooth, facilitated by shared values about spending and saving that we discovered during our courtship. My business income has provided stability that allows Robert to pursue his historical research without pressure to generate immediate revenue. His pension and Social Security have eliminated the feast or famine cycles that characterized my earlier self-employment, creating security that feels like luxury after years of uncertainty. Together, we've been able to make improvements to the house and garden that neither of us could have afforded individually. Travel has become one of our greatest shared pleasures, though we approach it with the measured pace of people who've learned that the journey matters as much as the destination. We've visited famous gardens throughout the United States, collecting ideas and inspiration that we've adapted for our own space and my client projects. The trip to England's Cotswolds last spring fulfilled Robert's longtime dream of seeing the cottage gardens that influenced American landscape design, while my favorite excursion was the sustainable farming tour of California's Central Valley that introduced us to water-wise growing techniques we've since implemented at home. Each trip has deepened our appreciation for what we've created in Maplewood Heights, while expanding our vision of what's possible in landscape design and community building. We return from travels with renewed enthusiasm for our own garden and neighborhood, bringing fresh perspectives to familiar spaces and relationships. The contrast between exotic destinations and home ground has taught us that contentment comes not from constantly seeking new experiences, but from finding depth and meaning in the places and people we choose to commit to fully. The seasonal rhythms of gardening have become the framework for our marriage, providing structure and anticipation that keeps our relationship feeling fresh, even as it deepens into comfortable routine. Spring brings the excitement of planning new projects and watching dormant plants return to life. Summer offers the satisfaction of maintenance and the daily pleasure of peak bloom. Autumn provides opportunities for reflection and preparation, while winter creates space for indoor projects and the planning that will shape the following year's garden. These cycles have taught us patience with each other's moods and needs, understanding that relationships, like gardens, go through periods of dormancy and growth, challenge and abundance. We've learned to appreciate the quiet seasons when little seems to be happening as much as the dramatic moments of obvious progress. The garden has been our teacher in this regard, demonstrating that the most important work often happens underground, invisible to casual observers, but essential for long-term flourishing. Our dinner conversations have become wide-ranging explorations of ideas and experiences that feel like the best kind of continuing education. Robert's historical perspective illuminates contemporary events in ways that make news feel less overwhelming and more comprehensible. My practical experience building a business provides case studies for discussions about economics and social change. We read books together, watch documentaries that spark hours of analysis, and maintain the kind of intellectual partnership that keeps both of us growing and learning. The physical intimacy of our marriage has surprised us both with its durability and capacity for evolution. Popular culture suggests that passion fades with age and familiarity, but our experience has been exactly the opposite. The emotional safety we've created together has allowed for vulnerability and experimentation that were impossible in our younger, more insecure relationships. We've discovered that desire can deepen with understanding, that attraction grows stronger when it's based on genuine appreciation for character, as well as physical appeal. Saturday mornings have become sacred time in our household, dedicated to leisurely breakfast and garden planning that feels more like meditation than work. We sit at the kitchen table with coffee and notebooks, discussing which plants need attention, what new projects we want to tackle, how the changing seasons will affect our maintenance schedule. These conversations inevitably wander into broader topics, but they always return to the practical matters of tending the space we've created together. The community garden project we initiated 3 years ago has become one of our most satisfying collaborative efforts. What started as a proposal to convert an abandoned lot into shared growing space has evolved into a neighborhood institution that brings together residents of all ages and backgrounds. Robert coordinates the educational programming, organizing, workshops on topics ranging from composting to seed saving, while I handle the design and installation aspects. The project has created friendships across generational and cultural lines that have strengthened the entire neighborhood. Sunday afternoons often find us hosting informal gatherings that have become tradition among our circle of friends. People arrive with dishes to share and stories to tell, lingering on the patio until sunset paints the sky in shades of pink and gold. These gatherings feel like the best of small-town life, creating the kind of community connections that make ordinary weekends feel special. Children play while adults talk, and everyone leaves feeling more connected to neighbors who've become genuine friends. The writing project Robert began last year has consumed his winter evenings with the kind of focused passion I recognize from my own business development phases. His book about the horticultural history of Ohio will be published next spring by a university press, the culmination of research that began as personal curiosity but evolved into scholarly contribution. Watching him discover this new form of creative expression has been thrilling, proof that growth and achievement aren't limited by age when passion and persistence combine with opportunity. My own creative evolution has taken the form of teaching, first through informal workshops for neighbors and clients, then through formal classes at the community college's continuing education program. The courses I develop focus on sustainable landscape design and native plant gardening, subjects that combine my professional expertise with environmental advocacy that feels increasingly urgent as climate change affects growing conditions throughout the Midwest. Teaching has revealed capacities for public speaking and curriculum development that I never knew I possessed. The photography hobby I developed to document my garden projects has unexpectedly become another source of income and creative satisfaction. Local magazines have begun purchasing my images to illustrate articles about landscape design and seasonal gardening, while my social media accounts have attracted followers interested in seeing how our garden evolves throughout the year. The visual documentation of our work has also proved valuable for client consultations, providing concrete examples of how various design principles translate into real-world results. Holiday traditions have evolved to reflect our merged families and chosen community, creating celebrations that honor both past customs and present relationships. Christmas morning begins with breakfast for Maria's family, followed by an open house that includes neighbors and friends who've become part of our extended family. Betty always brings her famous cinnamon rolls, Frank documents everything with his camera, and Janet contributes desserts that represent her ongoing attempt to restore her reputation through superior baking. The memorial aspects of our garden have expanded to include tributes to other people who've shaped our lives and community. Betty's late husband is remembered through a bench positioned to catch the morning sun, where he used to sit during his final years. Frank's parents, longtime neighborhood residents, are honored by a native wildflower meadow that attracts the butterflies his mother loved to photograph. These additions have transformed our private space into something approaching public art, a landscape that tells the story of community continuity across generations. Estate planning conversations that once seemed premature now feel essential as we consider how to preserve and transfer what we've built together. The garden represents thousands of hours of labor and decades of careful plant selection that shouldn't be lost when we're no longer able to maintain it. We're working with local conservation groups to ensure that the mature trees and rare plants we've established will be protected regardless of future ownership changes, creating a legacy that extends beyond our own involvement. The marriage enrichment retreat we attended last fall provided tools for communication and conflict resolution that have enhanced our partnership in ways both subtle and profound. Learning to identify and articulate our different conflict styles has reduced the frequency and intensity of disagreements while increasing our appreciation for the strengths we each bring to problem solving. The weekend also connected us with other couples navigating the unique challenges of later life partnership, creating friendships that provide both support and inspiration. Our financial planning has shifted toward philanthropy and legacy creation, as we've realized that our combined resources exceed our personal needs. The scholarship fund we established at the community college supports students pursuing careers in landscape design and environmental science, creating opportunities for young people who share our passion for sustainable land use. We've also designated portions of our estate for conservation easements that will preserve natural areas in our region, ensuring that future generations will have access to the kind of natural beauty that has enriched our own lives. The daily rhythms of married life have settled into patterns that feel both predictable and surprising, structured enough to provide security, but flexible enough to accommodate spontaneity and growth. Morning coffee together sets the tone for days that might include anything from routine garden maintenance to unexpected visitors to impromptu adventures. Evening conversations on the patio provide closure for each day while setting intentions for the next, creating continuity that makes time feel precious rather than burdensome. Looking back over these 5 years of marriage, I'm struck by how profoundly love has changed not just my daily experience, but my entire understanding of what's possible at this stage of life. The woman who thought romance was behind her at 52 could never have imagined the depth of partnership and passion that has characterized these years with Robert. We've proved to ourselves and our community that second chances are real, that love doesn't follow social schedules, and that the best chapters of life often begin when you've stopped expecting them. The garden continues to evolve with each passing season, just as our relationship grows deeper and more complex with time. The foundation we established during that first summer remains solid, but everything built upon it has exceeded our original vision in ways that remind us daily that the most beautiful things often emerge from the simplest beginnings. A conversation about yard work became a love story that has enriched not just our own lives, but the entire community that witnessed and supported our journey. Standing in the kitchen window where Robert first appeared with his morning coffee, watching the sunrise illuminate the space we've created together, I feel the profound gratitude that comes from unexpected blessings fully received and properly appreciated. At 57 now, I understand that age brings gifts as well as limitations, that the wisdom and confidence earned through decades of experience can open doors that seemed permanently closed. The garden around me is proof that beautiful things can bloom in any season when conditions are right for growth, and that the most meaningful partnerships are those built on shared labor, mutual respect, and the willingness to tend something larger than either person could create alone. 10 years have passed since Robert first spoke those words that changed everything between us, and this morning I find myself sitting in the same spot where our love story began, watching the sunrise cast familiar shadows across a garden that has become the living symbol of everything we've built together. The woman reflecting in this quiet moment bears little resemblance to the cautious landscaper who arrived that first day with her heart carefully guarded and her dreams safely contained within professional boundaries. Love has a way of expanding us beyond the limits we set for ourselves, revealing capacities for joy and partnership that we never imagined possible. The garden has matured into something that exceeds even our most optimistic early visions. What began as a restoration project has evolved into a masterpiece of sustainable design that attracts visitors from neighboring states who come to study. Our integration of native plants with traditional landscape elements. The memorial rose bush still anchors the space, but it's now part of a complex ecosystem that supports dozens of bird species, countless beneficial insects, and a rotating display of blooms that ensures beauty in every season. This space has become our greatest collaborative achievement. Proof that love can create something larger and more lasting than either person could accomplish alone. Robert's transformation from retired teacher to published author and sought-after speaker has been remarkable to witness. His book about Ohio's horticultural heritage won a State Historical Society award last year, leading to consulting opportunities with museums and historical sites throughout the Midwest. Watching him discover this unexpected career has reminded me that growth doesn't stop at any particular age, that new chapters can begin whenever we're brave enough to pursue them. His confidence as a public speaker has grown with experience, and the passion he brings to preserving garden history has infected audiences across the region with appreciation for the cultural significance of landscape design. My own business has evolved beyond anything I could have envisioned during those uncertain early years. Green Thumb Landscaping now employs 6 full-time staff members and maintains a portfolio of commercial and residential projects that spans 3 counties. More importantly, the work has shifted toward restoration and conservation projects that feel like genuine contributions to environmental preservation rather than simple beautification. Last month, we completed a major wetland restoration for the County Parks Department, a project that will benefit wildlife habitat for generations while providing educational opportunities for schools and nature groups. The teaching component of my work has become equally fulfilling, as the community college courses I developed have grown into a certificate program in sustainable landscape design that attracts students from across Ohio. These young professionals bring energy and fresh perspectives that keep me current with developing technologies and environmental research, while my experience provides practical context that bridges the gap between theory and real-world application. The intergenerational exchange has been mutually beneficial, creating mentoring relationships that extend far beyond the classroom. Our house has become an unofficial headquarters for environmental education in Maplewood Heights, hosting everything from rain garden workshops to native plant sales that fund conservation projects throughout the region. The quarterly garden tours we organize have raised thousands of dollars for local environmental groups, while creating awareness about sustainable landscaping practices among homeowners who might never have considered such approaches. These events have transformed our private passion into community activism that feels both meaningful and enjoyable. The relationships that sustained us through early challenges have deepened into the kind of chosen family that enriches life in ways blood relations sometimes cannot. Betty, now 81 and still formidable, has become the grandmother I never had, offering wisdom accumulated through decades of community involvement and personal resilience. Her stories about neighborhood changes over 48 years provide historical context that helps us appreciate how dramatically our street has evolved while maintaining its essential character. Frank's obsessive documentation of local history has yielded a comprehensive archive that the Historical Society will eventually inherit, ensuring that future residents will understand the community traditions they're joining. His photographs of our garden's evolution have created a visual record that demonstrates how patient cultivation can transform even the most neglected spaces into places of extraordinary beauty. More importantly, his friendship has provided Robert with the kind of masculine companionship that balances our intense partnership with broader social connections. Maria's family has become central to our lives in ways that have surprised all of us with their naturalness and depth. Her children consider our house their second home, arriving for weekend visits with sleeping bags and garden tools sized for small hands. Teaching them to identify plants, prepare soil, and understand the cycles of growth and dormancy has connected us to the future in ways that make our own aging feel less like decline and more like natural progression toward the role of elder wisdom keepers. The grandparent experience has revealed dimensions of Robert's character that I find endlessly endearing. His patience with children's questions and natural ability to translate complex concepts into language they can understand speaks to the teacher he'll always be at heart. Watching him build fairy houses with our granddaughter and explain pollination to our grandson has shown me aspects of gentleness and playfulness that decades of marriage continue to reveal. Financial security has allowed us to approach philanthropy with increasing sophistication and impact. The conservation easements we've established will preserve natural areas in perpetuity, while the scholarship fund we created has already supported 12 young people pursuing careers in environmental science and landscape design. These legacy projects feel like natural extensions of the values that drew us together. investments in a future that will extend far beyond our own involvement. The health challenges that inevitably accompany aging have been met with the kind of partnership that transforms difficulty into opportunity for deeper connection. Robert's recovery from his second, more serious heart attack required months of rehabilitation that tested our relationship in ways we hadn't anticipated. Learning to navigate his physical limitations while maintaining our shared activities required creativity and patience, but the process ultimately strengthened our appreciation for each other's resilience and adaptability. My own encounter with breast cancer 3 years ago brought us face to face with mortality in ways that were terrifying, but ultimately clarifying. The months of treatment and recovery forced us to confront the reality that our time together, however wonderful, was finite and precious. Robert's unwavering support during chemotherapy and his gentle insistence on maintaining hope when I felt overwhelmed by uncertainty demonstrated the depth of commitment that makes marriage a true partnership rather than simple companionship. Travel has remained one of our greatest shared pleasures, though we now choose destinations with greater consideration for accessibility and comfort than during our more adventurous earlier years. The garden tours of Scotland and Ireland that we completed last spring represented the fulfillment of dreams we'd carried for decades, while providing inspiration for landscape projects that will occupy us for years to come. The photographs and plant specimens we collected have become the foundation for a new garden room that celebrates Celtic design traditions adapted for Ohio's climate. Each journey has reinforced our appreciation for home while expanding our understanding of what's possible in garden design and community building. The contrast between exotic destinations and familiar surroundings has taught us that contentment comes not from constantly seeking new experiences, but from finding depth and meaning in the places and people we choose to commit to fully. Our own garden provides as much wonder and satisfaction as any famous destination when approached with the right combination of attention and appreciation. The seasonal rhythms that structure our life together have become more precious as we've grown older, marking time in ways that feel meaningful rather than simply chronological. Spring planting has evolved into an annual celebration that includes neighbors and grandchildren, creating traditions that will outlast our own involvement. Summer maintenance has become a form of meditation that provides both physical exercise and mental clarity, while autumn preparation feels like an investment in future beauty that reflects our faith in continuity beyond our own participation. Winter planning sessions have become increasingly focused on legacy considerations, as we work to ensure that the knowledge we've accumulated will be preserved and transmitted to future gardeners. The detailed records we maintain about plant, performance, design decisions, and maintenance requirements will provide invaluable guidance for whoever eventually assumes responsibility for this space. Creating these archives feels like a form of love letter to the future, a way of sharing what we've learned with people we'll never meet, but who will benefit from our experience. The daily routines of married life have settled into patterns that feel both predictable and surprising, structured enough to provide security but flexible enough to accommodate the spontaneity that keeps relationships fresh. Morning coffee together remains sacred time that sets the tone for days that might include anything from routine garden work to unexpected visitors to impromptu adventures. Evening conversations on the patio provide closure for each day while creating space for dreams and plans that keep us focused on the future rather than dwelling on limitations. Our communication patterns have evolved to include the kind of shorthand that develops between people who've shared years of experience and observation. A glance can convey understanding that would require paragraphs to explain to outsiders, while silence has become as comfortable as conversation. The trust we've built allows for honesty about fears and frustrations, while maintaining the respect and affection that make difficult conversations possible rather than destructive. Physical intimacy has deepened rather than diminished with age, supported by emotional safety that allows for vulnerability impossible in younger, more insecure relationships. The cultural narrative that suggests passion fades with time has proved completely false in our experience, as desire has grown stronger, when based on genuine appreciation for character as well as physical attraction. The freedom that comes from accepting our aging bodies has paradoxically increased rather than decreased our capacity for pleasure and connection. Looking back over this decade of marriage, I'm struck by how profoundly love has transformed not just my daily experience but my entire understanding of what's possible at this stage of life. The woman who thought romance was finished at 52 could never have imagined the depth of partnership and passion that has characterized these years with Robert. We've demonstrated to ourselves and our community that second chances are real, that love doesn't follow social schedules, and that the most beautiful chapters of life often begin when conventional wisdom suggests they should be ending. The garden that brought us together continues to evolve with each passing season, just as our relationship grows deeper and more complex with time. The foundation we established during that first summer of restoration remains solid, but everything built upon it has exceeded our original vision in ways that remind us daily that the most beautiful things often emerge from the simplest beginnings. A conversation about landscaping became a love story that enriched not just our own lives, but the entire community that witnessed and supported our journey from strangers to partners, to the kind of couple that young people point to as proof that lasting love is possible. Standing in the kitchen window where Robert first appeared with his morning coffee, watching another sunrise illuminate the space we've created together, I feel the profound gratitude that comes from unexpected blessings fully received and properly appreciated. At 62 now, I understand that age brings gifts as well as limitations, that the wisdom and confidence earned through decades of experience can open doors that seemed permanently closed. The garden around me is living proof that beautiful things can bloom in any season when conditions are right for growth, and that the most meaningful partnerships are those built on shared labor, mutual respect, and the willingness to tend something larger than either person could create alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.